She didn't lose her baby. She lost half of herself and never found out until it was almost too late. He raised a child for 5 years, held him, named him, shaped him, and had no idea there was another one, breathing, growing, waiting, to babies born into the same silence. Divided by coma, by crime, by a man who thought he knew everything and understood nothing at all. The first thing Adaze noticed about Kang Yoon-sik was not his face. It was the way the room changed when he entered it. Not loudly. Not with the theatrical violence she had read about in news reports that got scrubbed from the internet within hours of posting. It was quieter than that. A shift in temperature. A collective recalibration. The 12 men seated around the boardroom table didn't snap to attention. They contracted, subtle, instinctive. The way animals behave near something they cannot outrun. Adaze had been in the room for 40 minutes already. She was the translator for the Korean English side of a trade mediation, a logistics company. Ostensibly, with interests across 3 continents. Her job was language. Her job was to be invisible. She was very good at her job. Yoon-sik didn't sit immediately. He stood at the head of the table and scanned the room, methodical, unhurried, and his eyes landed on her. She looked back. Most people didn't. She knew this because she had watched it happen in the 3 seconds before his gaze reached her. Men who controlled empires found something to study on their phones. Assistants became suddenly fascinated by the wall. Even the senior negotiator from the Belgian firm, a man with 30 years in the field, seemed to discover an urgent interest in his cufflinks. Adaze looked back, not as a challenge, simply because looking away first had never come naturally to her. And she was not going to start learning the habit in a boardroom in Gangnam. Yoon-sik's expression didn't change. He sat down, the meeting proceeded. She translated. He spoke less than anyone expected a man of his position to speak. Sharp interjections, precise corrections, nothing wasted. When the Belgian representative tried to reframe a clause that Adaze had already translated accurately, Yoon-sik glanced at her. "That isn't what I said." "I know," she replied, in Korean, without looking up from her notes. "I translated what you said." He's paraphrasing for advantage. A pause. "Say that again." In front of the room, she did. The Belgian representative looked as though someone had poured cold water into his shirt. The Korean team, Yoon-sik's men, said nothing, but the quality of their silence shifted fractionally. Approval, maybe. Or simply recalibration. After the meeting, she was packing her materials when his shadow fell across the table. "You're not from the agency." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Private consultant." "This is my 4th engagement with the logistics group." You knew he was misrepresenting. Anyone paying attention knew. "I just said it in a room where it mattered." He studied her with an expression she couldn't name, not quite curiosity, not quite amusement, something more careful than both. Most translators don't intervene. I wasn't intervening. I was translating the subtext. That's not what translation is. "Then we define translation differently," she said simply, and closed her folder. She expected him to leave. Men like that, men whose gravity warped the room around them, did not stand making conversation with contract translators. They moved on. They always moved on. "He didn't move on dinner," he said. Just that, no question in it. Adaze looked at him squarely. She had grown up with 3 older brothers and a mother who ran a market stall with more authority than most CEOs. She had learned early that the way to neutralize a man who expected compliance was to meet him with something he wasn't prepared for. Simple, quiet refusal. "No," she said, and she left. She was back in the building 3 days later for a follow-up session. He was waiting in the lobby, not ostentatiously. He was standing near the window in a dark coat, speaking quietly to Park Dae-young. His second in command, a broad-shouldered man who looked at the world like he was permanently preparing for it to attack him. But Yoon-sik turned the moment she walked through the glass doors. And she knew then that the waiting hadn't been accidental. She ignored the small, inconvenient thing that shifted in her chest. "You said no," he noted. falling into step beside her. I did. Why? Because yes would have been unwise. And wise, he repeated, as if tasting the word. That implies you considered it, briefly. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, a fractional curve of the mouth that probably constituted a full grin for a man like him. Dinner, he said again. Somewhere neutral, public, you choose the location. She stopped walking, turned to look at him directly. In the gray soul morning light, without the architecture of the boardroom framing him, he looked, she searched for the word. Tired, not weak, not soft. Just tired in the deep, settled way of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and had simply stopped noticing the weight. It should not have moved her. It moved her slightly. 1 hour, she said. I choose the place. And you do not ask me anything I'm not willing to answer. Agreed, I mean it. I know, he said. That's why I agreed. The restaurant she chose was a small Korean-African fusion place in Hongdae run by a woman from Senegal who had married a soul chef. It was loud and warm and completely, deliberately unlike anywhere a man of Yoon-sik's profile would typically be seen. She watched him look around at the mismatched chairs and the hand-painted menu boards and the group of university students 3 tables over who were definitely not going to recognize him. He didn't comment. He sat. He ordered carefully, based on what she recommended. You're testing me, he said. I'm eating dinner, she replied. You chose this place to see how I'd respond to somewhere I don't control. She tilted her head. How are you responding? Fine, then you passed, she said simply. He laughed then, a real one, quiet and sudden, like it surprised him. She felt it in her sternum and told herself firmly that it meant nothing. They talked for 2 hours. Not about his business. Not about the logistics company or the trade mediation or the things she had translated, that she'd already decided to forget. They talked about her Lagos, her mother's market, the scholarship that brought her to Seoul, the precision she found in language, the way she could hear the gap between what someone said and what they meant. He listened in a way that most people didn't, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. She asked him only one personal question, near the end. What do you want that you don't have? A long pause. He looked at his hands on the table. Quiet, he said finally, just quiet. She understood that. She understood it too much. 6 weeks passed, not every day. Not even close. 3, 4, 5 stolen hours carved out of margins of his schedule and hers, coffee. A walk along the Han River at dusk. One evening in her apartment where they talked until 2 a.m. and he fell asleep briefly on her couch and she sat across from him and watched him breathe and understood. Precisely and with a clarity that scared her, that she was in very serious trouble. She knew what he was. She had never pretended otherwise. The news articles that got scrubbed were easy enough to find if you knew where to look. The Kong Syndicate. 12 years of control over certain import and export routes through the peninsula. Rivals who disappeared. Money that moved in ways money shouldn't move. And Kong Yoon-sik at the center of all of it. Not a man who had inherited power, but a man who had built it, who had decided at some point that the legal world had failed him and had constructed another one from scratch. She knew all of this. She saw him across the table, tired and careful, listening to her speak about the tonal patterns in Igbo, and she knew all of it, and she stayed anyway. That was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. She told herself she could leave whenever she chose. She had been telling herself that for 6 weeks. And every morning she was still in Seoul, and every evening she was still choosing him. The night it happened, she wasn't supposed to be there. She had a morning flight to Nairobi for a separate contract. 3 days. A diplomatic conference, clean and straightforward. Her bag was packed. Her itinerary was printed. She had said goodbye to him the evening before in the parking level beneath her building. Quiet and unambiguous. The way you say goodbye to something you've almost convinced yourself wasn't real. Take care of yourself, Yoon-sik. He had looked at her with that still, heavy gaze for a moment too long. Then, you'll be back. Not a question, not a request. Just a fact he seemed to have decided without her input. She had driven away feeling something she refused to name. At 11 p.m., her flight was canceled. Severe weather system over the East China Sea. Next available departure. 6 a.m., she sent the notification to her client. She stood in her apartment with her packed bag and the silence pressing in from all four walls, and she picked up her phone. She put it back down. She picked it up again. He answered on the second ring. A daze, just her name. He always answered like that, like he had been waiting. My flight was canceled, she said. A pause. Are you all right? She stopped. Looked at the packed bag by the door. Looked at the city through the window. I don't want to be alone tonight. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the words neither of them had said in 6 weeks. All the careful distances they had maintained. All the moments they had both looked at the line between them and stepped back. I'll come to you, he said quietly. She didn't tell him not to. He arrived without his security. She noticed that the absence of the black car, the absence of Park Dae-young's watchful shape at a respectful distance. He came alone, in a coat that was slightly damp from the rain that had started. And when she opened the door, he looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night in the restaurant. Tired and careful, and something else she'd been refusing to name since the beginning. They had coffee. They talked. The storm outside the window made the apartment feel smaller, warmer, separate from everything. And at some point, the talking stopped. She had thought about this. She was honest with herself. She had thought about it many times. She had assembled arguments against it like defenses. She knew his world. She knew the cost. She knew the specific kind of destruction that happened to people who loved the wrong man and were not careful enough about it. All of that was true. And when he reached across the table and touched the back of her hand, not taking it, not pulling, just touching, she understood that knowing the cost and being willing to pay it were two different calculations. And she had, without entirely meaning to, already made her decision fade to black. Morning arrived gray and quiet. She was awake before him. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully. The way you breathe when something has shifted and you're trying to decide how much weight to assign it. Then she heard it. From somewhere in the apartment, muffled, barely audible through the closed bedroom door, voices. Low and controlled. Park Dae-young's, another she didn't recognize. She dressed quickly, opened the door. Two men stood in her living room. Not hostile, positioned. They had let themselves in with a key she had never given anyone, which meant Yoon-sik had one and had shared it with his team, which meant her apartment had never been fully hers to begin with. Park Dae-young turned when she appeared. His expression didn't change. He was practiced at giving nothing away. Ms. Adaze, we apologize for the intrusion. There's a situation. Yoon-sik appeared behind her in the doorway, dressed, his face already reset to something harder. He looked at his men. Something passed between them without words, the specific. Fluent shorthand of people who operate in a world where words leave too many traces. Go ahead, he said. The Incheon transaction. The Beak Group made a move last night. 2 of ours are in hospital. She watched Yoon-sik receive this information. Watched what his face did and did not do. Watched the man who had been beside her all night become someone she only partially recognized. Not cruel. Not dramatic. Just precise in the way that instruments are precise. He gave 2 instructions. Quietly. The men moved toward the door. She stood in her living room in yesterday's clothes. And the apartment that had felt small and warm the night before felt enormous and cold. He turned back to her. Adaze, don't, she said. Not angry, don't apologize, just go. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him choosing what to say, how to say it. Whether there was a version of this where the morning ended differently. There wasn't, he left. She stood at the window and watched the black car pull away. She had crossed the line. She had known the line existed. She had crossed it anyway, with clear eyes and a full understanding of every relevant fact. And now she stood on the other side of it and felt the specific weight of a decision that couldn't be unmade. He wasn't a man you escaped from. He was a man you survived. She had known that. She just hadn't realized until this exact moment that the surviving started now. She booked a later flight to Nairobi. She packed her laptop. She left her apartment and did not look back at the unmade bed or the 2 coffee cups on the table or the small domestic wreckage of a single night that had rearranged everything. 3 days in Nairobi. Then back to Seoul, then figure out what came next. She told herself the line was still crossable in both directions. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet, and the truth that would prove her wrong was already beginning, silent and absolute, inside her own body. She found out on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after Nairobi. She had been back in Seoul for 5 weeks. She had seen Yoon-sik twice in that time, carefully, deliberately, on her terms, dinners in the same loud Hongdae restaurant. No more nights that ended in unmade beds. She was rebuilding the distance, stone by stone, and he was letting her. Watching her do it with an expression she couldn't read and hadn't tried to. The test strip on the bathroom counter told her something she wasn't ready for. She bought 3 more from 3 separate pharmacies. She sat on the floor between her bed and the wall because somehow the floor felt more honest than a chair, and looked at for identical results and breathed carefully until breathing no longer required effort. A child, his child, in her body. She didn't panic. That was the thing about a daze. She didn't panic. She had learned to be still with terrible information until she understood it fully, and then, only then, to move. Her mother had taught her that grief runs fastest when you chase it. Let it come to you. She sat with the information for 6 hours. She thought about Yoon-sik, about what he would do if she told him. She did not think he would be indifferent. She had learned enough about him to know that indifference was not one of his modes. He would claim the child. Claim her, probably, in whatever form he understood claiming to take. And the child would grow up inside the gravity of that world, inside the syndicate, inside the careful violence of it, shaped by it whether they chose it or not. She thought about the 2 men who had let themselves into her apartment with a key she hadn't given. She thought about the Incheon transaction and the 2 men in hospital. She thought about the specific, fluent shorthand of men who operated in a world where words leave too many traces. She made her decision. She was on a flight out of Incheon within 48 hours. No note, no call. No text that could be traced or held against her. She deactivated the phone registered in Seoul and left it in the apartment alongside the 2 months. Rent she still owed, overpaid, in cash, so the landlord would take his time reporting an abandoned unit. She transferred her professional contacts to a routing address that could not be linked to her movements. She was thorough. She was terrified. She was on a plane going home. Her homeland received her the way it always did, loudly, warmly, without asking too many questions of the kind she couldn't answer. Her Aunt Ketchy, who had raised her through secondary school, put her in the guest room and fed her jollof rice and asked only, "Are you in trouble?" Not from the law, a daze had said. "Then you're home," Ketchy said, and that was the end of it. The pregnancy progressed slowly and then all at once, the way pregnancies do. The doctor in the local clinic, Dr. Mensah, a round-faced man with careful eyes who had been practicing for 30 years, ran his standard examinations. He was thorough. He was good. At 16 weeks, he looked at the ultrasound for a long moment. "Ms. Adaze," he said carefully, "I want to ask you something before I explain what I'm seeing." She looked at him. "Go ahead. Is there family support?" "Someone who will be with you through the delivery." She thought of Ketchy. "Yes, why?" He turned the screen toward her. To heartbeats. To separate movements, to small shapes curled together in the gray and white static of the image, occupying the same space the way two people share a room, aware of each other, adjusting to each other, already and unmistakably themselves. Adaze stared at the screen for a very long time. Twins she hadn't known. She hadn't even suspected. And in that moment, looking at two lives that were partly hers and partly a man she had fled from. She felt something break open in her chest, not grief and not joy, but something that contained both, something that had no clean name. "Are they healthy?" she asked. "Both heartbeats are strong. You'll need additional monitoring, but yes, as of now, they're healthy." He paused. "Do you want to know the sexes?" She shook her head. She wasn't ready, not yet. She needed to absorb the number first, too. She was having to. The months that followed were quiet in the way that held breath things are quiet. She didn't leave the house much. She helped Nkechi in the kitchen. She read, she slept long, strange, heavy sleeps full of dreams she couldn't hold on to. Sometimes, in the early morning dark, she would lie with one hand on her stomach and feel the two of them moving, and she would think, briefly, against her will, about Yoon-sik, about the tiredness in his face, about the laugh that had surprised them both. Then she would think about Park Dae-young standing in her living room, and she would remind herself of the decision she had already made. She was 36 weeks when the first warning signs came. Dr. Mensah admitted her immediately. Her blood pressure had spiked. One of the babies was positioned badly. He spoke in low, clinical sentences that she processed through a fog of exhaustion and pain. And somewhere in the middle of the night, during the delivery, her body made a decision her mind had no vote in. She lost consciousness. What happened next, she would only learn in fragments months later. From Dr. Mensah, from Kechi. From the nursing notes she eventually asked to see. The delivery had been complicated. Both babies had been born, a boy and a girl, born within 8 minutes of each other. The boy had gone immediately to the primary ward, placed in the main incubator under the single patient record that had been opened during intake. The girl, born second, had been transferred to an emergency secondary incubator in a different room when her oxygen readings dipped. The paperwork, in the chaos of the night, had not yet been formally linked to the primary record. Two babies into separate rooms, one file. Adaze had been moved to intensive care, and Kang Yoon-sik's men had arrived. She didn't know they had been tracking her. She had been careful. But careful is not invisible, and Yoon-sik had resources that did not require carelessness to overcome. They had been building a trail for months, quietly, systematically, and they had followed it to a clinic in West Africa on the night she gave birth. There were 2 of them. They spoke to no one. They went directly to the primary ward. They found one baby, a boy, small and fierce-faced and already gripping the air with his fists. They took him. No violence, no confrontation. In the chaos of a busy night ward. A woman in a coma and a paperwork system that hadn't yet registered a second patient. They simply took him and left. Dr. Mensah didn't know until morning. Adaze woke up on the 3rd day. Kechi was beside her. Her aunt's face, when Adaze opened her eyes, was the face of someone who had been rehearsing a terrible sentence for 72 hours and still hadn't found the right words for it. "The babies," Adaze said immediately. Her voice was almost nothing, dry and cracked. "Where are my babies?" Kechi's hands tightened around hers. Adaze, "Where are they?" Not a question. A demand. Her body tried to sit up and the pain in her chest was enormous and she didn't stop. "There's a girl," Nkechi said, quickly, before Adi's panic could fully ignite. "A girl? She's here. She's in the next room. She's healthy." Adaze, "There were 2. Silence. Nkechi. Her voice broke on the name. "There were 2. "I know there were 2. Where?" Nkechi's eyes filled. "They took him. Men came in the night. We don't know who, the police. There's an investigation. But they took the boy, Adaze. He's gone." The sound that came out of Adaze was not a scream. It was worse than a scream. It was the sound of a world that had been divided in half, split at the seam, clean and irreversible, into before and after. They brought the girl to her tiny, brown, perfect. Adaze held her and wept without sound. To rivers, one of relief and one of loss, running in opposite directions through the same woman at the same time. She named the girl Sena. She looked at her daughter's face, at the jaw and the brow that she already knew were his as much as hers, and she whispered a promise into the crown of her head. Lo, fierce absolute, I will never let anyone take you. And in Seoul, at the same hour, Kang Yoon-sik held his son for the first time. He looked at the boy's face and felt something he had no name for. Not tenderness exactly. Not yet, but the beginning of a shape that tenderness would eventually take. He named him Ji-ho. He did not know there was another. He did not know about the girl in the hospital room in West Africa. He did not know about the mother who had just had half her world taken from her without a name or a warrant or a single word of explanation. He just held his son and believed completely, genuinely, that he had the whole of what existed. To children breathing on opposite sides of the world. One father who thought he had everything. One mother who knew exactly what had been taken from her, and who would spend 5 years making sure the half she still held never, ever learned to trust the dark. Kawarafika Tales, Part 2, Chapter 4. The Mafia Boss's Return. 5 years later, Gi-ho got sick on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the doctors in Seoul were using words Yoon-sik had never had to learn before: rare, progressive, critical. By Saturday, the only sentence that mattered was the last one the specialist said before leaving the room. He needs a biological sibling match. Without it, we're running out of options. Yoon-sik sat in the hospital corridor for a long time. He had one son. He had been certain of that. His men had been certain. One baby, one night. One woman who had run and been found too late to be stopped, but not too late to recover what was his, except he pulled the original report. Read it again. Studied the intake records his men had photographed during the extraction. One file, one registered patient. A ward that had been understaffed, chaotic, middle of the night. What if they missed something? He called Park Dae-young at 2 a.m. Find her. She was in her mother's city now. A small house. A language school where she taught 3 days a week. A daughter who had her eyes and a jaw that Dae-young photographed from a distance and sent without comment. Yoon-sik looked at the photo for a long time. The girl had his brow. His silence in her posture. 5 years old and already carrying herself like someone who expected the world to require something from her. There was another one. He landed in Africa 48 hours later. A daze was in her yard when the black car stopped at the gate. She didn't run. She had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, and she had promised herself she would not run. She straightened. She put herself between the car and the door behind which Sina was sleeping. Yoon-sik stepped out. 5 years had done something to his face, not aged it exactly, but settled it. Pressed it into something harder and quieter than before. He looked at her across the yard and she felt the specific weight of him, that gravity that warped the air. And she held her ground. You had to, he said, not an accusation. A realization, arriving late and enormous. Yes, she said. He had raised half a truth for 5 years. And now the other half was asleep 10 feet behind her, and she would burn the world before she let him take her too. They did not speak gently. There was no version of this conversation that was gentle. 5 years of silence and theft and grief and a sick child who needed his sister. None of that had a gentle shape. You took him, she said. While I was in a coma. You sent men into a hospital and took my son. I didn't know there were two. He was mine. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped colder. He was in my body. I almost died delivering him. And your men walked in and took him like something they were owed. Yoon-sik's jaw tightened. I thought you were keeping him from me. I was protecting him from you. Silence. You knew what I was, he said quietly. I knew exactly what you were. That's why I ran. They stood in the yard while the afternoon light shifted around them, to people holding opposite ends of the same broken thing, neither willing to be the first to set it down. Then she asked the question she had asked herself for 5 years. Does he know about me? Yoon-sik looked away. No, something moved across her face. Fast, unguarded. Pain and fury and something older than both. He doesn't know he has a mother. He knows his mother left. A pause. That's all I told him. That she left. She laughed, short and hollow. You told a 4-year-old his mother left. What was I supposed to say? Nothing. Her eyes held his. You were supposed to say nothing until you knew the truth. And you didn't know the truth because you never asked the right questions. He had no answer for that. Because she was right. He had assumed. He had been given one baby, one report, one version, and he had accepted it because it was convenient to accept it. Because it gave him what he wanted with a justification he could live with. He had been wrong, and Jiho was sick. And Sina was 10 feet away, asleep and whole and unaware that her brother existed. I need her, he said finally. Not a command, something rawer not to take her. I need a blood compatibility test. Jiho he's running out of time. A daze, he's your son too. The silence that followed was the longest of her life. She had built 5 years of walls to keep him out. And her son, the one she never held, was on the other side of them, running out of time. Some doors, she understood now. You open not for the person asking, but for the child who couldn't ask for himself. Sina met her brother in a hospital room in Seoul. She walked in holding Addie's hand, serious-faced and silent the way she always was in new places. And she looked at the small boy in the bed and said, with the devastating directness of a 5-year-old, "You look like me." Jiho stared at her. Then he smiled. And something in a daze cracked open quietly and completely. Because that smile, that exact smile, was one she had only ever seen in her own mirror. The compatibility test came back positive. The procedure was uncomplicated. The doctors used a word a daze hadn't dared to use for months. Hopeful. Then 2 weeks later, they used a better one, responding, Jiho was going to be all right. Yoon-sik began dismantling things. Not overnight. Not cleanly. It was slow and deliberate and dangerous in ways she didn't ask about, because she understood enough to know that unwinding 12 years of constructed power was not a single decision but 100 of them, made in sequence, each one harder than the last. She watched him make them. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. Forgiveness was not a switch. It was a long road, and she was still near the beginning of it. But she watched him choose, again and again, the harder thing over the easier one, and she noted it, it counted. The last scene she would remember from that time was simple. To children asleep in the same room for the first time. Jiho on the left, Sena on the right, both small and breathing and oblivious to the architecture of pain that had separated them. She and Yoon-sik stood in the doorway, not touching, not speaking, just standing in the same space, on the same side of the same door, looking at the two halves of something that had been broken and was slowly, imperfectly, becoming whole again. Some things survive what they're not supposed to survive. Not because the damage wasn't real, but because what was lost keeps finding its way back. Jiho fell asleep that night still holding his sister's hand. He had never done that with anyone before. He didn't know why he trusted her, but he did. Tell me, if you were a daze, could you forgive a man who didn't know he'd stolen from you? And what about Jiho when he's old enough to understand everything? Do you think he'll forgive his father too?